So this morning I thought I would talk about some perhaps stress that we might be feeling around Monday's inauguration and other things that are happening in our world. But I want to start out with talking about the way back past my younger years. In 1967, a film came out called The Graduate. Maybe some of you remember this film. And the main character, his name was Benjamin Braddock. He just graduated from college and he was at a party or something and he was angsting about what he was going to do with his future. And he met an older man whose name was McGuire. So Mr. McGuire said, he said, "I just want to say one word to you." And Benjamin said dutifully, "Yes, sir." And McGuire said, "Are you listening?" And Benjamin said, "Yes, I am." So Mr. McGuire said, of course, the famous line, "Plastics." He said, "Plastics." And Benjamin said, a little confused, like, well, exactly what do you mean by that? And McGuire says, "There's a great future in plastics. Think about it. Will you think about it?" So, everybody in my generation, I was 17 years old when this film came out. We all thought this was pretty funny line, right? Still, it's still a pretty funny punchline. So we thought it was funny because Mr. McGuire was the older generation and he was offering this wisdom about getting involved in some kind of corporate project that involved plastics, and therefore he would be successful. But in 1967, nobody thought plastics was a dirty word in 1967. And now we know that plastics essentially are a forever entity that is harming the planet. And we're finding out that microplastics are in our bloodstream and all of this stuff. So plastics is no longer just a funny punchline. Just like, remember, Tupperware was a funny thing too. All these 50s housewives, stereotypical living room. Plastics, how to redo our lives so that we're not so dependent upon plastics. So, in 1970, by this time I'm in college, 1970, there were 4 students who were killed by the National Guard in Ohio State, by the Ohio National Guard. That was my second semester in college at the University of Texas. And this was kind of the culmination of a lot of social unrest that was going on at the time. There was the assassination of John Kennedy in 1963. Malcolm X was shot in 1964. Martin Luther King in 1968, as well as Bob Kennedy, who many of us had put our hopes on for the next president. And there was also the Freedom Riders during that time, a little earlier in the 60s, who were engaged in voter registration in the South. And many of them were also killed as they were trying to register African Americans. So because of Kent State, I spent 3 days sitting on the main mall in the University of Texas. And we listened to a lot of speeches, a lot of people talking about various things, including civil rights, the horrors and inequities of the Vietnam War. And if you know that people were men, not people, young men were being drafted to go, our friends, to go to Vietnam. And then there was the women's movement a little later and gay rights. And in the 80s, we all had survived, mostly gay men survived the epidemic. Some, many did not, of AIDS. So all of the turmoil around AIDS. So during this time, many people were absolutely sure there were going to be armed uprisings over what was going on with government. And for sure, there were bombings and there was violence. And there were organizations like the Symbolize Liberation Army. As you remember, they kidnapped Patty Hearst and all of the things that went on around that. So there was a lot going on during that time, and somehow many of us, most of us, survived that time of our early lives. And I'll just add, as the generation before us survived World War II and the Depression, and the generation before the we still have many of the kind of more mature version of these issues. We have the Me Too movement, we have Black Lives Matter, we have LGBTQ plus trans rights. And of course, global warming for most of us was not even on our radar back in the 70s and 80s and even the 90s. Although in 1962, Rachel Carson, she published Silent String, which was about the ills of pesticides like DDT. And in 1969, this was on Richard Nixon's mind, who I will just add, I thought was one of the worst things to ever befall the United States, to have Richard Nixon be president. In retrospect, I think perhaps I was overreacting. But it was on Richard Nixon's mind, and he created the Presidential Council on the Environment, and he got the National Environmental Policy Act passed in 1969. And that little thing that he did went right by me back then. So you may ask why I'm kind of giving this litany of woes, of social upheaval that were going on in my 20s. And part of my point is that we don't often have a clue about what's going to be important for the future. And we focus on what's actually happening in the present. Like, for example, at that time, we were all saying, save the trees, stop using paper. But now we're going, no, wood is a renewable resource, start using paper. And on Monday, as I mentioned earlier, Donald Trump is going to be sworn in as president of the United States. And for many of us, this is deeply concerning because he seems to be bent on revenge and want to, in particular, roll back many, many environmental protections that we've had up to this point. So we're very concerned about his possible policy agendas. So consequently, we face, I think, challenges right now. And even if you voted for Trump or didn't vote for Trump, we live in a world right now that seems very fraught with a lot of challenges that we have to deal with. So I'd say this is kind of the culmination of our, culmination is probably the wrong word, but this is a moment of progress, right? We're in a moment of this continuum progress that we theoretically have made as human beings. And we're worried about what that progress that future might bring. Future of AI, for example, what's going to happen. So I say, now take a deep breath. Now that I've told you all these terrible, ghastly things that have happened and planted in your mind and reminded you of the things that we might be worried about, we should take a deep breath. Reminds me of went to a Tai Chi class, actually Qigong class, but I was recall the Tai Chi that I'd taken, and they have a movement where you put your hands all the way up like this, and then you bring them down and you breathe. It's an amazingly relaxing, would you like to do this with me? So everybody, like, you just breathe in. Isn't that wonderful? I think that just gives me chills. I should do this more often, like every 10 minutes or so. I should do it like every 10 minutes or so.
That's the right thing.
So, besides that, I say, let's look at some Buddhist teachings. And Dogen wrote in the Gensho Koan, he said, "Yet flowers fall amid our regrets and yearnings and hatred, and here's the quote. I kind of question this choice of translation. Yet flowers fall amid our regrets and yearning, and hated weeds grow apace." In other words, things go away amidst our attachments and our regrets, and despite our best efforts, weeds grow, or delusion grows. But the key to this sentence to me is yet. He says yet. And this yet is what he's referring to, what came right before in Gensho Koan, the opening lines of Gensho Koan. And the opening lines start out with, when all things are the Buddha Dharma, and when all things are without self. So even though there is this Buddha Dharma that we practice, even though this practice is predicated upon remembering that we are in community with all of reality, which of course includes going to the grocery store, driving our cars, sitting here with each other. So the things that we do day to day, yet, even though we know this, in the midst of this, things die, we regret it, we grieve, delusion arises, our own delusion. We wish it didn't, but it does. So there we are, yet. And of course, that's where our practice happens, right? That's where realization flowers. So this yet is actually the kind of vibrant juice, if you will, in a way, of what our lives are like. And we do experience likes and dislikes. So Buddhism is not about jettisoning every like or dislike that you have. So we suffer, we do suffer. We suffer with fear, regret, yearning, and hatred, however words you want to use to describe your personal experience of suffering. We see the weeds, we see delusion spread. We see people and dreams and lovely flowers, and we realize that they will wilt and they will die, as will we. And then they transform into something else. Our lives, our ideas, what's happening, maybe transform into something else that we don't expect them to, or don't wish them to. So what happens when that happens? We usually become pretty stressed out about it. Maybe out of that stress, we become unskillful. Maybe we are unstable. We lose our equanimity. And in this case, perhaps we're frightened about the future. So, this is responding to these fears, regrets, etc. This actually is what Buddhism is about. Buddhism is about ending suffering. Buddhism is a path. Four Noble Truths there is, suffering. And there is an end to suffering, a path to the end of suffering. So what we talk about mostly is how do we negotiate this life as human beings in concert with all of reality's life as well, and support and realize that we are not separate from that life, because that is, in our school of Buddhism anyway, considered to be one of the pathways, a major pathway to ending suffering, or at least, let's put it this way, transforming the way we experience suffering so that we're not overwhelmed by these feelings that we have, that we know that they're there, we incorporate them into our lives, and out of that incorporation becomes equanimity and stability. In the classical Kuge and Shobogenzo, which means sky flowers, Dogen wrote this. He said, for example, the time and place of the opening and blooming of the blue lotus are in the midst of fire and the time of flames. Experiencing the actual time and place of this fire is the experience of the blue lotus. Do not drift by this time and place of the blue lotus flower. Okay, for example, the time and place of the opening and blooming of the blue lotus is in the midst of fire and at the time of flames. Experience the actual time and place of this fire is the experience of the blue lotus. Do not drift by this time. Do not drift through this time of your life and this place of the blue lotus. So a blue lotus in Buddhism represents the perfection of wisdom, in particular of the Bodhisattva Manjushri. So Manjushri is the Bodhisattva, the embodiment of being able to cut through delusion, because he or she sees all situations through or in or as their impermanence and as their interconnection. So we see this fluidity, and by seeing this fluidity, we see and understand this, and through that comes equanimity and stability. We have mental equanimity and stability in these difficult times of unrest, fear, and suffering. So one of the reasons why I mentioned all of that stuff going on in the 70s, 60s, and 70s is because here we are in 2025, and things have changed. Some of those things are better if we, from 1%, there is more equality, there are many more good things, and yet there are also things that are quite different. And when I was talking about plastics, we didn't even think about plastics back when I was 18 years old. When 67, I was 17. So never occurred to me. Now things have changed, and this is an example of things changing in a way that is not so good. But many things have changed in a way that are good. This sitting willingness, this is the Bodhisattva practice. The Bodhisattva sits in the middle of this with equanimity. There is no, the reason for Bodhisattva practice, the reason is this practice is to alleviate suffering. The path of the Bodhisattva is to continue to be reborn lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. They're sucked into the next lifetime because of their desire to want to help other beings. Most of us, I know this is certainly true of me, we're not perfect bodhisattvas. We are not always going to make the right choice in the sense of always having equanimity, always having stability, always being the person who does the right thing or helps and does the most helpful thing. But that is our vow, that is our goal, to engage the best we can in that activity. And when are we called upon to do that activity? We're called upon it as we sit in the middle of the fire of the blue lotus. Because the blue lotus, this wisdom and compassion, as those fires bloom our wisdom and compassion blooms when called for. And I think this is a time that it is called for. This is a time for us to try to find stability and equanimity within ourselves and for others, for each other. And I'm not talking about running around and doing something drastic. I'm talking about just being kind to each other, strangers, and with each other. and of course, the examples that we have about this, to me, is also about sitting in the Blue Lotus, is like, whenever these disasters happen, people step up. They drop the self, they drop their likes and dislikes, they drop their politics, they drop their ideas about other people, and they don't ask them, are you a Republican or Democrat? They just help them, right? And recently, down in LA, there was this, you probably heard this, a story about this guy who was taking care of his dad, who had just had surgery. And his father was fairly aged, and he was again recovering from surgery, but he was weak and he could barely walk. So he was basically in his bed recovering. And the fire comes, and the people come and say, you have to evacuate right now, the fire is going to burn your house down. And so the son got his dad on his feet and got him using the walker and got him out of the house. But the father was actually too weak to walk. And his son, understandably, wasn't going to leave his dad there. And a stranger in a car came along and picked him up. And the stranger took him as far as they could go before that they had to stop. And so the father and the son get out of the car with a stranger. And the son at this point starts to video them going down the street. And you can hear the son saying over the phone, we got it, Dad. We got it, Dad. Keep going. We've got it, right? And then the dad says, if we are ever in a position where the flames are right there, you just run and leave me here. That's what the dad says to the son. You just run and leave me here. This goes on for about 15 minutes. And then another person comes along and picks them up and drives them to safety. And then the son said later on the news, he said, they saved us. They really stepped up. These two strangers, they saved us. They really stepped up. I don't know if you heard this story on the news. I mean, this is a perfect example of the kind of generosity. Are those people who stayed behind with their garden hoses and also saved their neighbors' houses. So there's this way in which, as human beings, we're kind of schizophrenic. It's like situations like this happen and we're like picking people up, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're helping each other. And then when these things are not right in our face, we're like, me. Don't bother me, I'm stressed. Get out of my face. I don't like the new leaf, which is true. I don't like the new leaf. So it's like that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But when something big, and so let's take care of each other, because in a way, this is something big that's going on in our lives right now. Eileen, you were talking about cell phones and people getting cancer and all that. And that's what we hear on the news, right? Don't eat processed food. Don't do this. Don't drink coffee. Don't do this. Don't drink wine. And so we actually live in quite a stressful time right now. So as far as the fire goes, I, of course, hope that none of us are ever going to have to live through something like that. Although recently, the last few days, there's been this battery fire down at Moss Landing, and we're all concerned about whether or not we can breathe the air, which turns out we're pretty lucky. We can breathe the air around here. The plume is going in a different direction, but that's obviously, uncertainty. But isn't that, as human beings, we absolutely crave certainty. We don't like impermanence. But of course, impermanence is exactly what life is. Without impermanence, there would be no life. Without impermanence, you couldn't move your arm. It's like, it's absolutely like gravity, impermanence. So impermanence is a very, very, very good thing. And yet we really don't like it. Well, we like it when we want to get rid of the things that we don't like, but we don't like it. We want to keep the things that we do want. So in a way, we're kind of like little kids. We just throw ourselves on the back and like bang our heels on the floor and go, oh, no, please, no, not impermanence. So, but this is what Buddhist practice is about. Buddhist practice is about a lot about, as human beings, impermanence. Okay, impermanence. Now what? Impermanence. Flowers fall, weeds spread. I'm sitting in the middle of the flower of the blue lotus. Is that flower going to bloom or is that flower going to die? Am I going to be part of that process of helping that flower to bloom or not? Sometimes I can be part of that process, and sometimes I can't be part of that process. But I also know that there are a lot of other bodhisattvas sitting in the midst of that flower with me. And so one of those bodhisattvas can pick me up when I can't do it. And when I can do it, I can pick up some other bodhisattvas myself. So that's what Sangha is, right? That's what we do. That's what we strive to do for each other, to pick each other up when we can. So I just want to remind us to return to our bodhisattva vow. We say, beings are numberless, I vow to save them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. But we also say, Dharma gates are boundless. Every moment, Dharma gates are boundless. Buddha's way is unsurpassable, I vow to attain it. We are all also Buddhas. We are bodhisattvas. So this bodhisattva Buddha sitting in the middle of the blue lotus, I vow to be in that blue lotus, even though sometimes I can do this and sometimes I can't do it. But I can be picked up and helped and supported by everyone else who's also doing it. It's kind of like a mutual aid society. Dogen calls this continuous practice. So let's remember our vow and recall that we live in a conditioned state, in interconnected conditioned state, an impermanent state. And cultivate gratitude for each other. Cultivate gratitude. That's so important. I get up in the morning and I go on and I get my paper and it's still dark. And then I can smell, the air is clear and I can smell it. I can see the stars out there and I go like, wow, isn't this amazing? Then I go read the paper and go, oh no, So it's like that. Sometimes it's deep, deep gratitude, but I think we should try to cultivate that underlying deep gratitude of this absolute amazing thing called life. Vanished in an instant, as Dogen says in Fukan Sezenki. So gratitude for all beings, for clouds, earth, rain, and even fire. So even this fire of the blue lotus, that we have gratitude for that. And that we recall when others are being unskillful, that we can be unskillful too, and that we cultivate patience for each other. That we can be quick to anger, or quick to become fearful, and that we understand that about others as well. And that these are human responses to flowers falling and weeds spreading. So recall our fallibility, our sameness, and that we are all bodhisattvas. We are all willing to sit in the middle of the fire. Even if you're not willing to sit in the middle of the fire, you're in the middle of the fire. So as all of us sit in the middle of the fire, Buddhist practice helps us sit in the middle of the fire with equanimity, with stability, so that we cultivate that. So I'm giving this talk today because I want to remind myself of that. I want to remind you of that. I want to remind us of the utmost importance of continuing our practice at a time like this, when things are very difficult. And I want to be a person who supports others. I think all of us want to be people who are bodhisattvas sitting in the middle of the blue fire in the blue lotus. And sometimes we succeed at that, and sometimes we fail, but that we continue to get up and make our best effort to do that. So I wish that for all of us, and that I hope that we can all be generous towards each other. Thank you.